Welcome to CD 5 of the Conversational Hypnosis Home Study Program. On this CD entitled Emotional Triggers, Controlling Inner Pictures and Feelings, you'll discover the powerful access state principle, which is the key to behavioral change and all learning. We'll look at the emotional triggers and the pictures themselves, which control people's feelings, and how to direct both those triggers and those pictures in order to create the kind of feelings which will change the behaviors to one that's more useful for you and for the people that you're working with. We're going to address the way people feel, how to change the way people feel, and how to intensify those emotions in order to get a more useful outcome. Finally, we'll look at the powerful Abasale formula, which will actually allow you to use the access state principles together with your emotional triggers in order to get certain specific actions and behaviors out of people. So, as soon as you're ready to learn all this, just sit back, relax, and enjoy learning conversational hypnosis. The first principle we're going to address is called ASP, or the access state principle. Now, each one of those words is very important because it will give you the keys to changing the way people think and behave. Now, very often people think that in order to change or persuade someone, they need to be very persuasive or influential or somehow have really logical arguments. And whilst logic and those persuasion arguments themselves can be useful, the more important rule when it comes to influence and persuasion is don't change people's minds, change their mood. When you change people's moods, their minds will actually follow. And this comes directly from the access state principle. Consider this. Back in the 1970s, there was a study which was carried out in which a whole bunch of students were given a bunch of nonsense syllables to memorize. Now, half of these students memorized them while stone cold sober. The other half, on the other hand, were given a couple of shots of alcohol beforehand just to get them a little bit tipsy before they started learning these words. Then, at the end of the trial, they just waited a few hours to allow those people who'd had a bit of alcohol to sober up. And then they gave them all a test. Funnily enough, as you'd expect, the people who were sober whilst learning the words actually did better in the test at the end as well. The interesting thing is, when they reloaded the experiment, only this time, after everyone had a chance to sober up again, they gave both groups a couple of shots of alcohol. In other words, they re-induced the original state, the one of light inebriation. At that point, the second group did better, the ones that had learned the actual syllables whilst they were slightly drunk. Now, from this initial piece of research, hundreds of studies have followed, which have declared that the way people code information and all your behaviors, all your learnings will be codified inside a specific state of mind. When you change your state of mind, you also change the behaviors you have access to and the information that you can actually remember. Think of your mind as being different rooms. Each room is a specific state. Inside that room, you will have stored all the learnings, all the information, and also all the behaviors, the muscle memory, for the things you've learned to do. So whilst you're in that room, you have access to all those things. The further you go away from that room, the harder it is to access it. This, by the way, explains why some people have trouble in exams. They normally revise under no pressure at all and are relaxed and calm and confident. Yet when they enter the exam room itself, all the pressure gets the better of them. The pressure changes their state. The tension inside them actually gets them to switch off the information that they had access to in the past. So suddenly, this person that actually knows all the answers to the question can't find the answers. Their mind literally goes blank. It's not that the whole mind goes blank. It's just that they've entered a room in which those answers don't happen to be stored. And you know this to be true because the moment they walk out of the exam room and the pressure has disappeared, what happens? All the answers they didn't have in the examination room come flooding back. Now, this is a general principle which is true of everything you do. Sports people know this. That's why before they go to a big match or a big game, they have a little ritual designed to trigger the emotional response which they need to be in a peak performance state. On this CD, you'll discover the secrets to help people access those kind of states in which their ability to perform at peak level gets improved, their ability to focus, their ability to solve problems, their ability to be inspired and have a better life. All these things will be embedded inside the state, and you will have the master keys that will unlock that door and allow people to change their moods. Now imagine that a person's nervous system was like a bunch of fairy lights around a Christmas tree. Every time that a unique configuration of these lights lights up, a new state has been created. Now this state is a complex thing. It's partly the emotional thing. It's also a physiological thing. So for example, when you are waking up in the morning and you just remember a dream, you'll have realized that whilst you maintain the exact same position, you can pretty much remember the old dream still. But the minute you move, when you roll over or sit up, suddenly the dream begins to drift away. And that's because your neurology is also part of your whole physiology, the way you carry yourself. So when you want to change the way people feel, when you want to change their state in order to change the way they think or their behaviors, you need to change the way they stand or carry themselves. You need to change the way they think, in particular the pictures they make inside their minds. And you'll also need to take control of the emotional triggers that actually trigger off all these various responses inside of someone. Now with conversational hypnosis, the access state principle becomes 10 times more powerful. And this is because hypnosis becomes like a platform to amplify experiences. It makes experiences more intense and therefore more powerful. So when you take a state in which someone is okay at performing something and you intensify it, the ability to perform that particular task becomes better and better and better as the state improves itself. With conversational hypnosis, you can help sports people improve their performance. You can help salespeople sell better. You can motivate your entire company, and you can just help your friends and colleagues and neighbors around you just have that much of a better life. Problems will seem easier to solve, and relationships will be smoother and more interesting because of this. So, remember that everything you learn on this home study program will still count. It all comes together into a beautiful mosaic where every piece has the effect of accentuating the impact of every other piece. The next principle we need to address is that of emotional triggers. Now, emotional triggers were first discovered at the turn of the last century, in about 1901 or 1902. A Russian researcher called Ivan Pavlov is most famous for discovering emotional triggers in what are called Pavlov's dogs. You probably already heard about them. In this experiment, Dr. Pavlov would take dogs and offer them some food, but just before he would shoot these food pellets down a tube into their mouths, he would ring a bell. Over a short period of time, the dog's mind associated the sound of the bell with the arrival of food, which meant that the actual sound of the bell would actually create salivation in the dogs, and this is an automatic nervous system function, something the dogs should have no control over. Now, people were fascinated by this because it's a very graphic example of how an activity which is outside of our conscious control can be brought into our conscious control by the way that we create triggers that set off that very same thing. Now, whilst a lot of people give Dr. Pavlov the credit for discovering these trigger mechanisms known as conditioned responses in traditional psychology, these conditioned reflexes were actually discovered much earlier by an American doctor called William Twittmeyer. Now, he actually discovered something very interesting because he's the first man to have discovered the knee-jerk reflex, where if you hit someone on the soft part of the knee, they end up jerking the reflex, straightening the leg out. Now, as Dr. Twittmeyer was carrying out his research, he discovered that after several maybe 50 or 100 repetitions of actually striking the small hammer onto the soft part of the knee and straighten the leg out, that just the act of lifting the hammer as though it was about to strike would cause people to accidentally straighten out their leg totally unconsciously. This is a very powerful example of an unconscious trigger being implanted. Now, these triggers have been known to hypnotists actually for a long, long time now, in the form of post-hypnotic suggestions. And I'd really like to think of these emotional triggers as post-hypnotic suggestions that you can create for yourself. Now, some of these triggers, especially the emotional triggers, will already be created by the environment. So natural triggers will be things like this holiday song. Everyone has this holiday which they've been on maybe when they were younger or in a particular summer. And during that holiday, heard one particular song over and over again, and it became an association in their mind. So that whenever they hear that very same song, they just go back in their mind and relive and re-experience that beautiful holiday. Other examples of naturally occurring triggers might be like things like the smell of baking bread, which takes a lot of people back to maybe their grandmother's house or a place in which they grew up in. Other similar things would be the scent of perfume, the sound of someone's voice, a certain tonality, a certain phrase, a certain picture. Advertising works on this. Advertising makes a lot of products so prevalent inside your mind that you recognize the packaging. So when you walk through a supermarket, the one packaging that stands out is in the color and the shapes and the forms that have been advertised to you. So these triggers abound everywhere you go. And your purpose as a conversational hypnotist will be to be able to create your own hypnotic triggers so that you can begin to trigger people into emotional states and get certain behaviors as well as thought patterns out of people. Now, how do you do this? Well, the basic rules for implanting a hypnotic trigger in someone is to first of all follow the 4-stage protocol you learned all the way back on CD1. To refresh your memory, the 4-stage hypnotic protocol for conversational hypnosis is this. Number 1, absorb someone's attention. Number 2, bypass their critical thinking. Get rid of the guardian that holds onto the gate. Number 3, activate an unconscious response. Any unconscious response is fine, because step 4 will take the response you've activated unconsciously and utilize it or lead it in a new direction, the direction that becomes useful for you in whatever you happen to be doing. Now, the 4-stage protocol by itself won't actually implant a hypnotic trigger. What it will do is set the scene, lay the groundwork in which you can actually create your own emotional triggers, your own hypnotic triggers, which you can then fire off or use later on at will. So, assuming you've induced a pleasant trance, you've bypassed the critical thinking, and you have the unconscious mind playing ball with you, what do you need to do in order to be able to set a trigger? Well, the first thing you do is you have to access a clear state. So if you want someone to be, for example, be concentrated, you need to have a pure state of concentration. If you want them to be relaxed, they have to be purely relaxed. If you want them to be happy and excited, they need to be purely happy and excited. They can't have a mix of different states. For example, happy with a sense of regret, or relaxed but a sense of tension when they think about certain things. Because if you have a mixed state, all that your trigger will do is it'll trigger off the same mixed state. So be sure to get a clear state, and we'll find out later on in this particular CD how to do this. Once you have a clear state, you can set your trigger. Now, you can set your trigger in any one of the senses. You can make it a smell, a taste, a touch, a sound, or something that someone can see. Of all those senses, the easiest ones to work with are the last 3. Something you do so they can see it, something they can hear, so in other words, something you say, or like in Pavlov's dogs, the bell that you ring, or something that you do in the sense that they can feel it, a physical touch. Because these things will be things that you can recreate later and reuse. Once you've set your trigger, you will condition the trigger, maybe by a few repetitions, and then, very importantly, you will test the trigger. In other words, you will clear the mind, you will maybe distract them by something, and then you'll fire off your trigger again. And if it activates the emotional state that you'd set in the first place, well, then you know your trigger's working. So, over the course of this CD, we're going to look at how to create a state in someone, how to intensify that state in someone, and then how to use those particular states in order to activate or generate certain kinds of behaviors. So let's look a little bit more detail at how to actually set a trigger. The first stage of setting a trigger will be, as we said before, to use the 4-stage protocol to bypass the critical thinking. You see, if there's too much conscious involvement, there'll be a filter and a tendency to reject, possibly, your trigger before you set it. So you want to do this outside of someone's awareness, because that way it's more quickly and easily set. This does not mean you can't set triggers when someone's conscious attention is online. You can, either with their conscious participation, although sometimes that will actually create the law of reverse effect. And secondly, you may need to use more repetition when the conscious mind is there in order to overload the guardian and stop it from interfering. Now, assuming that you actually use the 4-stage protocol to make your life easier, the next thing you need to do is to direct someone's inner experience in order to access a particular state. For the purpose of these exercises here, we're going to access hypnotic experiences. Why? Well, you're doing conversational hypnosis, so you may as well access hypnotic experiences, which will help you to deepen your whole learning in this particular field. Now, the way to do this is one of 3 things. Number 1, you can ask certain questions, which will bring these experiences back to life. Number 2 is to offer descriptions, to use your language in such a way that it brings the pictures and feelings back up inside someone else. This, by the way, is typically what happens to you when you go to the cinema, where watching the screen and hearing the sounds around you begins to change the way you perceive the world, so you feel differently whilst watching the film, and very often it has an effect which lasts long after the film is over. The third method of directing people's inner experience is to fire an existing emotional trigger. Now, that emotional trigger may exist either because it was implanted naturally by the environment, or because you created it in a previous session and you're just using it to re-trigger the same experience. Now, this last one is particularly interesting to us hypnotists because it makes our job a lot easier over time when working with certain people. Anyone that's worked with me already begins to respond to my auditory or my tonal hypnotic triggers. So when I shift my voice tone to a certain tone of voice, all the people that have been working with me in the past begin to access hypnotic experiences. Now, this is a very important reason for you to actually have a different tonality for when you do hypnosis work than when you have a normal everyday interaction, because people will go into a trance when they hear your hypnotic voice over a period of time. In fact, this happened to me quite recently. I was giving a training session to someone, and in order to help 2 of the participants over something, I began to talk to them in a hypnotic way in order to get them to focus on the task in a particular way. Now, one of the other students in the room, just around the corner, began to hear my tonality, and because he's worked with me extensively in the past, he began to find himself dropping into a trance just because of the tonal patterns that I was using. Now, this can be fun and be great when you use it in certain context, but make sure you don't do it in other contexts. For example, when that person is driving a car and you happen to be in it too. So as this example demonstrates, you're going to be setting emotional triggers throughout your life, usually by accident. And now you can begin to polish up your act, so you actually only set the triggers for those things which will be useful for you to be able to trigger off later on. Things like happiness, good feelings, etc. Now, before you actually set your emotional trigger, once you've accessed the emotional state, you need to intensify the experience so that it's the cleanest, the clearest access state possible. The stronger the emotion, the better the trigger will work. The stronger the emotion, the more useful that particular state will be later on when you want to utilize it in order to change behaviors or thought patterns themselves. So you need to learn how to intensify experiences. Now, intensifying this response can be done in many different ways, which again we'll explore in this CD. Finally, you actually get to link the actual trigger that you've chosen for yourself to the actual emotional state, and then use that trigger later on to link it to an action. We'll come to that when we get to the Abseil formula. Now, how do you link your trigger with the actual emotional response? Well, that's actually the easy part. All you need to do is make sure that the emotional response has been activated and is as strong as possible, and then you set the trigger by just firing it. Now let's assume your trigger is a certain tone of voice. Let's assume that you're learning conversational hypnosis and you have a certain tonality in order to put people into trances. So my trance tonality is a slower, more relaxed tone of voice. And when people hear this tone of voice, they begin to go into a trance. Now that tonality itself won't do anything as if by magic. It will only work on the people who have had exposure to me before, who have been in hypnotic states whilst I've been using my hypnotic tonality. And that's the bit that sets the trigger to actually fire off the actual state. They happen at the same time whilst the emotional state is at its peak. Now, what else could be used? We could use a certain mannerism. For example, you could use a certain gesture like opening your hand and pointing it, or a smile, or a head nod, or a head tilt. These are all subtle triggers that you could use inside a normal conversation, which will allow you to set these triggers totally naturally and conversationally inside a normal conversation. So, the key to be able to set a trigger is, number one, make sure it's at the peak of the emotional experience, and then you do whatever it is that you want the trigger to be. If it's a tone of voice, you speak in that tone of voice. If it's a particular word, you say that word. If it's a particular gesture, you make that gesture. It's a particular touch, then you present that touch in a way that they can feel it. That itself will pair the state with the trigger, so that when you fire the trigger, it also fires a state. Now, sometimes you need to condition the trigger, which means you'll repeat it several times to get it there. As a rule of thumb, the more powerful the emotional response, the more quickly that trigger will be set, and the fewer repetitions you will need to make. So far you've induced a trance, you've accessed an internal experience in the other person, you've intensified the experience to get a purest access over an emotional response, and then you have set your trigger. You may have set the trigger several times to make sure that it particularly takes. The next step, the final step in setting your triggers, will be to test it. Break the state, change their mood, bring them back out of trance, make them think of other things, change your storylines. And then just fire your trigger again and notice what happens automatically. If they take on the same physiology, if their face begins to flush, they sit up, they breathe differently, in the same way as they did whilst they were in the emotional state, then your trigger has worked. If it hasn't, then go right back to square one and begin all over again. So let's look at the first way of directing someone's internal experiences in order to activate a certain emotional state. We're going to do this by asking questions. This is called a revivification. Revivification basically means bringing something back to life. Now, whenever you ask someone a question, in order to answer the question, they have to go to the answer, to experience it to a certain degree, in order to know what the actual answer will be. I ask you, for example, if you remember the last place you went on holiday, how hot was the sunshine? Now, if you think about the last place you went on holiday, you actually have to imagine the sunshine, remember how warm it was on your skin, in order to give me an answer. So you're already beginning to activate that very experience inside of your neurology. You're beginning to have that experience. I've actually induced a certain picture through a memory inside you, and that in turn has created the feeling. Now, it really helps if you do something called going first. You need to actually have the experience inside yourself first that you want someone else to have, because you will resonate it, you will sub-communicate it in all the subtleties in your tonality, the way you move, your body language, your gesture. And by sub-communicating this particular state, the other person's unconscious mind will begin to resonate, if you like, in the same frequency. They will pick up your sub-communications and begin to respond to those non-verbal suggestions as well. So, always set the scene inside yourself. If you want someone to relax, make sure you relax yourself. If you want someone to be focused, then focus in on them yourself. If you want someone to be excited, get excited yourself. Because nothing more incongruous than someone trying to get you to be excited whilst they're saying, get excited, and have you ever really had a good time? You don't want to be boring in the way you use your questions. Now the next thing you're going to do is, as you ask these questions, I want you to adopt a meaningful tonality. So it really seems like this is an important question. For example, I could ask you, well, what do you like to do to relax? Which is an innocent kind of question. Now I can ask the same question and say, what do you do when you really want to relax? Now notice how that second way of asking a question is much more powerful. It makes you want to respond more fully. Now that's partly because I'm also using embedded suggestions in my language, and we'll cover those more fully on the next CD. Now, another reason for it is because my tonality is suggesting that this is a very important question I'm asking, and in order to answer an important question, you'll go inside and activate the experience more fully in order to give me a better quality of answer. So, rule of thumb is, go first, activate the emotional experience inside yourself first, then ask questions about it in a meaningful way. Now, as the person starts answering you, you want to repeat back to them the exact same words, the exact same expressions, and the exact same tonalities they're giving you, because these will be their natural trigger words in order to access that experience for themselves. What you're in essence creating is a feedback loop. They give you an answer, you feed it back to them, you ask another question, and they'll have to go inside and intensify the experience until the experience becomes their reality. Now, something you'll find as you go through with this is that from time to time, people will begin to lean on certain words. They'll emphasize certain words. In other words, certain words will seem to be pregnant with meaning. They'll be more meaningful to that particular person. We call these words personal trance words because these are words that, for that particular person, have become naturally occurring emotional trigger words which will create mini trance experiences for them. When you hear them, or just using those words themselves in that particular tonality can actually have a profound impact on someone else in the way that they access trance experiences. So to summarize this particular process, you're going to enter the state of mind yourself that you want the other person to access. Then, in a meaningful tone of voice, you'll begin to ask questions about that experience that bring out sensory information. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. Then as they're answering, you will listen carefully and you will reflect back to them the precise words, phrases and tonalities that they're using. And when you capture the personal trance words, the words that they lean on particularly, you'll remember those because you can use them not just in this context, but they'll be powerful words to motivate them into different states of mind and get certain behaviors out of them in all contexts. Here's an example of revivifying experiences through questions in action. Now, bear in mind, first of all, that I can't talk to you. This is actually an interactive process, so that I'm going to hallucinate what your answers might be to my questions and feed those back instead. The other thing I'm going to ask you to do is to stop this recording until you're ready to put your undivided attention to this. The reason for this is because we will be using hypnotic language in the pieces about to follow. And even though I won't be feeding back your own personal trance words or your own particular experiences, you may still find it having a hypnotic effect upon you, and it's better for you to be able to put all your attention to this in order for you to learn safely and completely. In other words, if you're driving a car or operating any kind of machinery, just stop whatever you're doing before you listen to the next track. So tell me, what do you like to do to relax? Oh, so you like to lie out by the sunshine and enjoy the sunshine. So when you're enjoying the sunshine, what does it feel like inside your mind? Also, you like notice a calm, soothing effect. It's almost like you can see the lights dancing behind your eyelids. Then what happens? So you begin to drift to sleep. But you don't quite go completely to sleep. You just drift in that half asleep, half awake state. What does it feel like to be in that half asleep, half awake state? So you notice that your mind just expands and your internal pictures become fuller and richer, and all of your awareness rests on those internal images. And do you enjoy those internal images? Yes, you can enjoy those internal images so much. And do you notice where those images come from? No, you don't, do you? They just arrive all by themselves. And all the time, you can enjoy lying in the sun and drifting into that half asleep, half awake state. And you really don't need to think about anything at all, as you just enjoy that experience. And what a wonderful experience it is to have too. Now the interesting thing is that as you enjoy that experience all over again, your unconscious mind can learn about relaxation, about enjoying your life in so many different ways. And I don't know just when you realize that your unconscious mind has made you into a more relaxed person, someone more capable of enjoying life. Because sooner or later, you find yourself coming back out of that experience, don't you? So that the sun is still there, or maybe the sun's gone behind the clouds, and eventually you find your way back outside, and you realize it's time to get on with your day, don't you? So let's examine briefly what happened in that last quick example of questions to activate an experience. Notice how, as I asked my questions, I began to feed back the same language and began to drop more and more into my hypnotic tonalities. I left more spaces in order for someone to really go through the experience inside their own mind. And I began to just feed back the exact same experiences over and over again. Notice also the meaningful use of tonality and the way I focus on the internal experience in order to really activate it fully. Now, I don't have to focus as blatantly on an internal experience. I could equally ask about the events, for example, people who were there, things that they saw, things that they heard, things that they felt. That will allow you to have a more covert elicitation, a covert accessing of those experiences. But in this example, I went for a more direct route for you. Now, even though this was a short example, notice also how halfway through I did two things. The first thing I began to do was begin to introduce some hypnotic ideas, some hypnotic themes about relaxing and enjoying life. So in other words, I was using the mini trance induction, which I used through the questioning technique, to begin to offer some suggestions about relaxing further and enjoying life in general. I also began to offer you some descriptions which were not necessarily linked to the actual answers you gave me to the questions or the answers I imagined someone would give me to these questions. They actually became descriptions all by themselves. And that's the next category which we'll be exploring, which is activating the imagination in order to bring experiences to life in someone else. The next technique for accessing a state is basically to activate the imagination. You're going to use what we call sensory-rich descriptions or language, which appeals to all of the senses in order to describe a kind of picture, a word picture, that will vividly recreate inside someone's mind the actual experience they're talking about. Now, as you're doing this, remember to use the smooth transitions that you've learned previously. These transitions will allow you to flow smoothly from one thought or idea to another. Use language that appeals to all the senses, so use visual descriptions, things that they can see. Use colors, distances, objects, all those kind of things. Then you use auditory things, in other words, things they can hear, so the sounds around them, the pitches, the rhythms, the sounds of animals maybe that are in the area, people talking, those kind of things. Finally, also include kinesthetic sensations, in other words, feelings, both emotional feelings, but also proprioceptive feelings, in other words, things that touch them. Now, these can be as simple as talking about the sensation of their feet inside their shoes, of the touch of a palm of the hand on the wall, or they can be less mundane. So, for example, the feeling of silk sheets against their skin, or the touch of age-old parchment in between their fingertips. Now, the simplest way of doing this is, as before, go first. Now, in this particular instance, going first means not just have the emotional experience. For example, let's imagine that a way of relaxing might be going to a beach. So not only do you want to have the feeling of relaxation, of lying on a beach yourself, but you also want to internally visualize, imagine the whole scene laid out in front of you. Because when you lay it out in front of yourself, it becomes very simple to describe it to someone else. Now, one of the key secrets to this is being able to offer descriptions to someone of an environment which have to be there no matter what that environment is. I'll give you an example. Let's say someone enjoys swimming. If they enjoy swimming, there are certain things that will definitely be there. There'll definitely be water. There'll definitely be the sense of them touching the water, the feeling of the water. There'll definitely be a certain temperature. The things that you can't guarantee because you don't know what's inside their mind yet is what temperature that water will be, what the actual sounds will sound like. For example, are they swimming above water or are they swimming underwater? So the trick when offering sensory-rich descriptions in order to activate someone's imagination is to be as vague and at the same time as specific as possible. Remember from before how you want to use your language in a way that creates smooth transitions. Well, the same is true of your ideas. You want your ideas to flow smoothly so that one idea leads smoothly to the next. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. Now, the one thing you can remember, of course, is that the more they go into a trance, the more they follow your descriptions, the more abstract your descriptions can be, because they'll still follow along. So let's imagine that we're on a beach to do this exercise. What kind of things will you be able to see on a beach? Well, first of all, you will either see sand or pebbles, because that's really what defines a beach. You'll be able to see waters. Now, that water might be the water of a lake, or there might be the water of an ocean. The water will have a certain color, as will the sand. The sky will have a certain color. Maybe there'll be clouds in the sky, maybe there won't. Be careful of the clouds, because if you do offer a cloud as a description, make sure that you offer it in a soft frame. In other words, saying, perhaps you'll see clouds. That way, if they don't, it doesn't necessarily jar the reality. You want to always travel smoothly with the actual experience that your listener is having. Now, on a beach, you'll also have certain sensations you'll be aware of through your hearing. So there'll be the sound of the water, perhaps the surf lapping against the waves lapping against the shore. Maybe there'll be some animals around, perhaps a seagull. and you might hear the cry of the seagull. There might be some wind and the sound of the wind as it rustles through the air. There'll also be things you can feel. Again, the wind will be something you feel. There'll be a certain temperature. If it's daytime, perhaps the sun is shining. If the sun is shining, perhaps they'll feel that particular temperature. Notice how, of course, in the winter, the temperature will be different to the summertime. And these are all the descriptions that you can offer to someone to really bring that experience to life in someone. So let's take a look at an example of this in action. Now this example will again be including some mild hypnotic language, which means that if you're driving a car or operating any kind of machinery, please stop whatever you're doing so you can turn your full attention onto the exercise that is about to follow. Everyone's had the experience of relaxing on some beautiful sunny beach somewhere. Now, a friend of mine, John, recently came back from Mauritius, in which he had the very same experience that a lot of people have had to just, unwind and relax from a long, long time at work and finally just be able to let go of everything. Now, I think the interesting thing is that John is a writer. So the first thing that he realized when he arrived at the beach is that the sand was a beautiful golden color. There was not a speck of dirt in it. These beaches were kept pristinely. And as he looked at all that beautiful yellow sand, he could see out in front of him the waters rushing in. And the water was this beautiful turquoise color, which blended into the sky off on the horizon. There was not a single cloud in the sky. Now, I don't know if you can imagine it. Where the sky and the sea meet, there's a nice, beautiful, thin line, which goes on for what seems like forever. As he looked at that scene, he noticed that his feet were beginning to sink into the sand. And he had this sort of feeling of sort of relaxed comfort as the cool sand underneath the sand that was on top began to work its way into his toes. And that's when he first realized that he's really at a beach and could finally relax. Now the sun was warm but not too hot. He could feel the temperature against his skin as he began to feel that sense of comfort that relaxing in the sunshine brings. Now before he lay down to just close his eyes and relax, he realized that looking around him there was other people. Some were chatting quietly, and over there in the distance there was a seagull just circling round and round. From time to time he could hear the seagull, and it came almost in a rhythm, the same rhythm as the waves would be lapping on the shore by the sea. And all the time the sunlight would glisten and glitter off the top of the waves. And John found this whole sight so appealing, he decided to go for a swim. And the first thing he realized when entering the water was the difference in temperature between the air on the outside and the cool water on the inside. At first his feet would notice it, then his whole legs, and slowly as he walked deeper into the water, more and more of that surrounded him. The sounds had a curious way of reflecting off the surface of the water, and when he put his head underneath the water, all the sounds just became faded and muted, very peaceful and still. And as he swam, he could feel his arms moving, his legs kicking in a particular rhythm. At one point he just rolled over onto his back and just drifted, letting the sea carry him gently as the sun would shine on his face and beamed a beautiful, warm, soft golden glow. He began to imagine that golden glow really going through him, unwinding the tension and relaxing every muscle. And all the time it was just floating on that beautiful, calm ocean scene. Now the interesting thing is that whilst John had a lot of things to learn at his new place of work, all the new things he was learning seemed to kind of drift lazily through his mind and begin to come together, began to form a pattern, so that as John relaxed drifting on that calm ocean, feeling a touch of breeze from time to time against his skin. So his inner mind, his unconscious, would begin to just assimilate all those new experiences and the information so that he could learn. And by the time he left that scene and went back to the hotel, it seemed as though so many different things had clicked inside his mind, and he really didn't know how it happened. And the interesting thing is, he didn't even care how it happened. He just enjoyed the experience of letting his inner mind do all the work for a change. So let's take a quick look at that little induction we just did there. First of all, notice how I set the scene. I set the scene in doing a couple of things. First of all, I made sure I pre-selected all the right kind of environments to make sure that my description fitted. So because I wasn't sure what kind of seaside scene you would normally pick for yourself, I made sure it was a sandy beach rather than a pebble beach. I made sure it was a warm, sunny day rather than a cold, blustery day, or even going to the beach at night time. So I set that scene in advance, which already allowed your mind to select from all your memories of beaches and choose the one that would fit the experience I was going to describe. Now, I used a slight linguistic subtlety or a technique called the My Friend John technique. By talking about my friend called John and putting all the experiences in his shoes and just describing how he experienced things, it allows you to kind of rest back and just absorb the information without having to criticize and analyze it. After all, this wasn't your experience, it was some guy called John. But in order to understand it, you still have to actualize experience within yourself. Now notice again how I cycled through the various senses, vision, hearing, and feelings, and also allow that to roll one into the other. For example, seeing the waves, you could hear them, or seeing the seagull, you could hear it. You could also hear the waves and then look over to them. You could feel the temperature of the sand and look down and see how there are different layers. Notice how the senses overlap with each other and lead smoothly from one into the other. Notice also how I'm using all the lessons that you've already covered so far. So we're using some of the hypnotic principles. We're using a change in tonality, in pace and in rhythm. I'm also extending my pauses, because every time you pause, it allows that person time to really actualize experience and go inside of it. Pauses are very important to allow people time to reflect and actually have the experience for themselves. Now place this experience in a side of kind of a story, and we'll be covering storytelling in order to beat through or burst through resistance on CDs 7 and 8. But the essence of it is something you can do straight away. In fact, you don't even need to tell a story. You can actually quite happily just offer the descriptions quite directly. And notice how people will change their state as you describe it. Now here are a couple of things you can do to improve the effect even more. First of all, you can use vivid metaphors in order to really bring an experience to life. For example, in the old classical world of hypnosis, when a hypnotist would do some of his suggestibility tests, they'd often use vivid metaphors like glue being poured over the hands or a vice coming and pressing the hands tighter and tighter together. Because it creates a vivid image inside the mind that the unconscious can attach to. So using these kind of vivid metaphors can allow it to happen inside of a story or any other framework as well. For example, if you want someone to relax, you can just tell them to relax, or you can tell them that it's just like their muscles are melting right through the floor. Notice how that little metaphor creates a much more powerful impact. You can say relax, or you can say loosen your muscles, let them melt right through the floor. And notice how that improves or enhances the experience. Another way to enhance the experience is to take each modality and break it down and polish each of the elements that makes it up. So when you see things, you can see colors, but if you see a vivid color, it becomes more intense. So you can see a blue ocean, or you can see the beautiful blue ocean. You can see the scene in front of you, or you can see that scene expanding wider in front of you. It's coming out to meet you. Now, as a rule of thumb, think of it in terms of cinema. When you go to cinema, the larger the screen, the wider the screen, the closer the screen, the louder the sounds, the more intense the experience is going to be for you. So do the same thing with the people that you're describing things to. Make the scene more vivid by making the picture larger, wider, closer, making the sounds clearer, richer, the colors more vibrant. There's a big difference between seeing a picture on a small, tiny black and white screen and this vivid surround sound color panorama with surround sound stereo. So now you've discovered how to actually access the states in the first place. The next question is, how do you intensify people's responses in order to create the kind of states that are actually really worth setting a trigger to? Remember that the key to setting emotional triggers is that have a pure, clear state, and that the state is as strong or as intense as possible. That way, your trigger will actually set more quickly. The rule of thumb is, the more powerful the state is, the more easily you'll get to trigger it and re-trigger it later on again. It's also a useful thing to have powerful states because powerful states lead to powerful behaviors or powerful responses. So your ability to really intensify people's responses is going to be one of the key things that you'll be learning on this particular home study program. Now there are essentially 4 different techniques that you can use together or separately in order to intensify people's responses. Now before we get into those 4 techniques, I want to make sure that you have your basics still down, which is the first thing you need to realize is that some people, and in fact some states, will be easier to get into and easier to augment than others. Why is this? Well, some people have got a very narrow range of awareness, or range in which they allow their emotions to escape them, if you like. And to get those people into those states will require that much more effort because their neurology hasn't been used properly in a long, long time. So sometimes it just requires that they get warmed up a little. Other times it requires a little bit of practice over periods of time to get increasingly better and stronger states. Now, make sure when you're doing this that you have people's attention completely locked in. The more you have a focus of attention, the more you can separate their attention from all the other things, the trivia of everyday life, the more clearly they will access the state, and the more simply your trigger will be set. Now, with that in mind, let's turn to the first technique for intensifying responses. The first technique is actually pretty direct. And let's just use your language in order to directly suggest an intensifying of the emotion. Remember, when using your language, to include all the principles you've been learning on this home study program. So you'll include the idea of piggybacking suggestion, compounding effect. You can include the hot words that you'll be learning on CD5. You'll be using the personal trance words you discovered on this very CD here. All this will come together to give some very straightforward, direct suggestions to intensify this feeling. So how would that sound? You can say things like, now take that feeling and make it stronger, and stronger still. That's a very direct way of putting it. You can also say, the more you pay attention to this feeling, the more it will begin to grow all by itself. Now notice we're beginning to get a little bit more covert, a little bit more indirect. Because all we're suggesting is that the more they pay attention to the feeling, the more it'll grow by itself. Now, we're not telling them to have this experience, and yet they're still going to have that experience because of the form of the suggestions you've taken. In fact, when you consider the linguistic bridges we covered all the way back on CD3, you'll have an almost infinite variety of ways in which you can directly suggest that a particular feeling, emotion, or state become intensified. How do I mean this? Well, simply take your linguistic bridges and use that to piggyback suggestions for intensifying the emotion onto any other experience they're having. In other words, their awareness, the way they're thinking, where they were focusing, anything like that. So you might say something like, now as you pay attention to that feeling, you'll notice it beginning to grow. And the more you notice it growing, the more powerful it becomes. Now you don't have to pay attention for the feeling to grow right now, because feelings like these have a habit of growing all by themselves. So hopefully from that you'll realize how simple it really is to suggest that the emotions will intensify. You can do it very directly, go ahead and make those feelings stronger, or you can do it a little bit more indirectly, a little bit more smoothly, as in the example I just gave you. The next technique for intensifying responses is called layering emotional triggers. Now, as its name implies, you're going to lay different layers of emotional triggers one on top of the other, and each layer, like a glazing or like a polish on a table, will make it stronger and shine more brightly. Now, what layers of emotional triggers will you put on top of each other? Well, there's two essential ways you can do this. The first thing you can do is take a whole bunch of different emotions and set triggers for these one at a time, and once you have them, combine them all together on one master trigger, so that the master trigger becomes a cocktail blend of all these beneficial states. Now, if you do this, make sure that the states match each other. So for example, if you have excitement and energy and power, you don't want to be adding calm states like tranquility or calmness, because they take energy away from it. So you've got to make sure that these states back each other up and become stronger. A much simpler way of doing this, of layering emotional triggers, is to use the same trigger to layer different examples or different access experiences of the same state. Let's take this for example. What if you want someone to perhaps relax a little bit more, feel calm? Now, let's say that you described to them a holiday you've been on in which you felt relaxed and calm. And at the peak of that, you set your trigger. Then you ask them about an experience they had, what they like to do to relax. Let's say they like to read a book, and you go through your questioning technique in order to really revivify or bring that experience back to life for them. And as they go into the experience, you use the exact same trigger again. So now you've doubled the emotion on the same trigger. Then you might give them another example and put another trigger on top. You may ask them about a different time when they were relaxing and go through the questioning process again. So all of a sudden, you have 4, 5, 6 separate experiences of the same emotion, all set to the same trigger. And because they're all combined together on the same trigger, they begin to augment, they become more powerful and more intense every time that you do this. Now the key here, of course, is that you use the same trigger each time, and that you set the trigger and you don't move on to the next experience until you set a clear and precise trigger on the first one. The next technique uses non-verbal modular enhancers in order to intensify the experience. Well, what do we mean by this? Well, if you think about the first technique, which was using the words to suggest and intensify the experience, you can create suggestions with all kinds of things other than words. For example, if I set the trigger and use a quiet word like calm, then if I say the same word with more emphasis, calm, there's a suggestion built into the tone to make the same experience stronger. So you can say to someone, make the strong experience, make it stronger, stronger, and stronger still. And notice how that every time my voice gets more powerful, it actually is a non-verbal suggestion, a tonal suggestion, to intensify the experience. Now you can do the same thing, by the way, in any of the sensory modalities. So you can do it visually by, for example, using a gesture. And let's say your gesture is a hand sort of waving at the waist level. If you then begin to raise the hand as you're talking, it begins to suggest that whatever the experience is, make it more. It begins to lift it up. In the same way as moving your hands down tends to suggest to calm things down, to reduce an experience. So now you can use these non-verbal cues as a way of actually telling the unconscious mind, now pump this one up, or just tone this one down a little bit. The final technique is very straightforward. You're basically going to take control of people's inner pictures, sounds, and sensations in order to intensify the feeling portion of the whole thing. How do you do that? Well, whatever pictures they're making, just ask them to make them brighter, bring them closer. Whatever sounds they hear, make them louder, more vibrant. Imagine yourself to be a kind of Steven Spielberg of the mind and really build up all of the senses so that it really overloads their neurology and creates a really powerful impact. Now, one way to do this is very directly, giving them instructions or descriptions, make the bigger larger, brighter, and all the rest of it. Another way to be more indirect about it, more covert about things, would be to take your storytelling skills and weave all these augmentations of the senses into it. One way, for example, might be to use your gestures to physically make the pictures look larger. So you expand your hands, your eyes look up. You're creating those senses for yourself. Remember, if you go first, see those pictures becoming bigger, brighter, louder, and then you can describe that, or part of your mannerisms will make those pictures become larger for the other person as well. Another way might just be to use your sensory-rich descriptions in a more clear way. So you can tell them about the vivid colors, the sharpness of the focus of the whole scene. So you're actually painting a mental picture, which will in effect end up intensifying the emotions for them. Before we begin to look at how to use emotional triggers in the context of persuasion, I'd like to talk a little bit more about setting covert triggers, that is to say, setting emotional triggers which are outside of the other person's conscious awareness. To a certain extent, we're constantly setting triggers in other people and totally unaware of it. After all, remember that a trigger is set when you have the cue, action, or word at the same time as the peaking of an emotional state, and then the unconscious mind associates those two together. So there's three things happening at the same time: the emotional state, the actual cue trigger itself, and an association occurring at the unconscious level. Now, this is one of the reasons we want to use trance later on, because it helps to create the unconscious connections that we really want to be using. Now, setting an unconscious trigger, one which is outside of normal conscious awareness, is something that you can do in a very straightforward sort of way. One simple way to do this is to use stories and to set the triggers casually within those stories, as though you're gesturing or by the kind of words that you're using whilst telling your stories. Now, we will look at storytelling in more detail on CD 7 and 8 of this program. For the moment, just rest assured that you can tell a story, and then at the peak of that story, you set the trigger. Then you move on to another story, and just as you see the response coming up in the other person, go back to CD 2 if you need to, and really get your signal recognition systems down. Because once you see them really getting into that state, you want to again set your cue, your trigger. It'll be a word, it'll be a gesture, or a certain tone of voice, or a physical touch. And it doesn't really matter which of those it is. It can even be a combination of them. The important thing is that you can recreate that trigger anytime you wish to, because that way you get to fire off the trigger and get the resultant state at the end of it. The beauty of using storytelling in order to access the state in the first place is that stories have a habit of depotentiating the conscious mind anyway, because we're used to, when stories come along, we're just suspending our belief and just going along with the flow of things. The important thing in the story is also that it creates these emotional events for people that you can later on set triggers to. So really, when it comes down to CD 7 and 8, really spend the time that you need to really master the art of storytelling. It'll help move your covert hypnosis skills to a completely different level. Now we're coming to the end of this CD, and I'd like to take you finally through a simple formula for behavioral change, or to influence people's behaviors using the principles you've learned on this CD. The formula is called ABSAIL, A-B-S-A-I-L, and each of those letters stands for a specific step within the process of persuasion. The A stands for absorb attention. That comes straight from the 4-stage protocol. B stands for bypass the critical factor. Again, we're using the same first two steps from the four-stage protocol. The S is where you begin to move away from the four-stage protocol a little bit, or more accurately, you refine what we mean by it. S stands for state change. So if you want to change someone's mind, first change their mood. If you want to help someone change their behavior, first change their mood. So once you've absorbed their attention and bypassed the critical factor, the next step, S, is to change their state. The A and the I both stand for augment and intensify. So you want to augment the actual state. You want to intensify the responses you're getting so that you have the most powerful responses you can get. Now at that point, you can actually set a trigger or go straight to the L, which stands for link to action. So you'll start with absorbing someone's attention. You'll bypass the guarding the gate, the critical factor. You'll change their state. Then you'll augment and intensify that state so it becomes really jazzing and buzzing. And once they're all lit up, their neurology is lit up like a Christmas tree, you'll link that emotion, that feeling, directly to the action you want them to take. Now, if you want to see the Abseil formula in action, you only have to turn on your TV set and watch any advert. The adverts do exactly this. They absorb your attention. They kind of bore you into submission, so you bypass the critical factor. They'll change your state and intensify it with images of sexy cars, beautiful women, fantastic locations, whatever it is they happen to be selling. Or, even if it has nothing to do with what they're selling, they'll add the glamour in some way so that your emotions are strongly aroused. And then they'll place the product, which is what the linking to action is all about. In terms of your persuasion strategy, you may want to think of it a little bit like building pressure in a pressure cooker. All the first steps are there designed to build up the pressure in the cooker, and then finally that last step, linking to action, is like the release, where suddenly all the steam comes blowing out. So when you take your time to really set up the conditions properly, to access states properly, using the access state principle and all the techniques you've learned on this CD, then when you finally come to the action point, the linking to the action, the people who you're trying to influence will be going like a steam train all by themselves. Well done. We've reached the end of CD 5, so let's go straight into the exercises. The first exercise I'm going to have you practice is to make a list of 5 to 10 useful states that you can access inside of people. These states could be things like relaxation, enthusiasm, fascination, curiosity, desire, depending on where you want to use it. Fascination and relaxation and things like these can be very good for hypnotic work. Curiosity, desire, enthusiasm can be great for motivational work. Now, once you have your list of 5 to 10 states, the first step for you to do is to practice getting into those states yourself. Make them as strong inside of you as possible. And notice the kind of things you must do inside your mind to make that happen. The next step, once you can actually experience those states yourself, in other words, you've gone first, the next step is to tell someone else about each of the memories you used in order to create those experiences inside yourself. Remember, go first and then watch them follow you. The next exercise is pretty straightforward as well. You're going to take the same 5 to 10 states that you listed in the first exercise, and you're going to ask people in your general day-to-day interactions about typical situations in which they would have experienced those sort of states. So for example, you can ask them about the holiday they've been to, a book they've read recently, a film they've gone to, a hobby that they're into. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as the end result is the kind of states that you had in your original list. Ask them about that and get a little bit meaningful in your questions, just like we've been practicing earlier during this CD. Whilst you're doing this, I want you to watch their reaction. Watch how they begin to drop into that state. Use your signal recognition system to find out. And then, when they seem to hit a plateau, a peak level, then simply set your trigger. Say a word, touch them maybe on the shoulder or something, or more elegantly still, make a simple gesture that they can see and associate to that. As an addition to this whole exercise, also make a point of listening out for the personal trance words. And once you have found them, make a point of using them as often as you can just to notice the effect it has on the other person. The final exercise in this CD is one that I'm going to ask you to come back to after you have finished with CD 7 and maybe even CD 8 on the storytelling. The reason for this is I'm going to ask you to start telling stories where you vividly describe the states that you've listed in your initial list. Now, as you're doing this, I want you to start using all the intensification of responses that you've learned. So describe the states, layer in multiple states onto the same trigger, modulate your non-verbal communication to enhance it, augment the senses with your descriptions, and, if you need to, make direct comments, giving direct instructions to intensify it as well. I want you to start putting this all together into a very beautiful and a very powerful hypnotic communication. Congratulations, you've reached the end of this CD 5. On the next CD, CD 6, Advanced Hypnotic Language, you're going to start taking your hypnotic language to completely new heights. We're going to explore how to create precision language which has a more powerful and a more emotional effect on people. We're going to explore how you can use ambiguous messages so that you begin to communicate on several levels at the same time. One of the powers of hypnosis is the ability to give one message which is heard consciously and give a completely different message which the unconscious mind will hear and respond to, all in the same conversation. We'll also be looking at some of the more advanced language techniques for creating confusion and overload to really get past this critical factor, the guardian that is at the gate. Finally, we'll also look at embedded suggestions, which is yet another way of creating another layer of suggestion, another multi-level approach to creating instruction to the unconscious. Embedded suggestions are beautiful things because you can embed a specific suggestion inside a statement that has absolutely nothing to do with the suggestion you're giving. So the conscious mind will be thinking along one track completely, whilst at the unconscious level, they're getting a completely different message and responding to that in a very powerful way. Now enjoy these exercises, and I look forward to seeing you again on CD 6, Advanced Hypnotic Language.